The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with Anuj Desai, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping to shape it. Today on the show, I've got Shane MacGuill. Shane is Senior Head of Tobacco Research at Euromonitor International. He's a colleague of a previous guest, Spiros Malandrakis. Shane looks after the tobacco industry from a data and analysis point of view, but has broadened his scope to also look at the emerging cannabis industry and how it intersects with tobacco. He's a regular contributor to various magazines, and I've seen him speak at various conferences, so I'm really pleased to have him on. Welcome, Shane.
Thanks, Anuj. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you for joining me. So loads to talk about. As mentioned, we talked with Spiros about the alcohol industry, but it would be good to get input from big tobacco too. Before we crack on with that though, as is tradition, it'd be good to sort of hear a bit about your backstory. What exactly do you do at Euromonitor and how does it intersect with cannabis?
Yeah, so I've been working on tobacco at Euromonitor for about 8 years now. As you said, I'm responsible for the tobacco database that we have here, so the data analysis that we produce on the tobacco and nicotine industry. When I first started working on tobacco about 7 or 8 years ago, it was an industry that was in terminal decline, but a very gentle sort of terminal decline. I mean, the volumes were going down at a manageable level year on year. The industry was able to keep sort of charging people more for the products they were selling, and there wasn't that much disruption on the horizon. I mean, one of the first meetings I had in the tobacco space was with a company called Nico Ventures, which was a subsidiary of BAT at the time, and they were looking at something which has now become the Voke inhaler, which was just launched in the last few weeks. So that sort of gives you a sense, I think, of the timelines in terms of innovation in the tobacco nicotine industry. But there wasn't really, there hadn't been that emergence of e-cigarettes or vapor products as a force within the space. And there was just this sense of kind of almost gentle managed decline within the industry. And in that space of time, I think what's happened obviously is that firstly e-cigarettes emerged and as viable alternatives to the cigarettes. So actually a product that people were kind of proactively choosing to consume instead of the traditional cigarette product. And at first that was dismissed by the big tobacco companies. Then they realized that they needed to sort of look in more depth at this area. And if you look at, sort of coming forward to the present day, what Juul, for example, has done in the US, which really sort of put the cat amongst the pigeons in the US in terms of the cigarette industry there. We've moved into a period where now the industry is in kind of turmoil, might be too strong a word, but is really very much in the disrupted stage. And cannabis really sort of forms a part of that. I started looking at cannabis and its implications for tobacco about 3 or 4 years ago. Again, initially coming to it from this mindset of this will be difficult for the industry to get involved with. This is probably not something that the industry will want to become involved with, for various reputational reasons and so on. But the more and more I looked into the industry, the more and more I looked into the plant initially, the sort of potential benefits products with cannabinoids in them could bring to the consumer. The industry itself, as it was, the cannabis industry, was much more kind of well advanced than what I'd seen in the e-cigarette space. It was, if I can use the word, more impressive in terms of the level of sophistication that was already there within the industry. And the more I looked into it, basically, the more I became convinced that this was something of importance for the tobacco industry. Something that went beyond just a threat or an opportunity for the industry, but actually an area where they needed to play, if I can put it that way, and the tobacco companies had a right to win as well in cannabis, I think, as well. Also.
Lots of interesting points there. Before we go into the cannabis side of things, you mentioned that tobacco is in a general state of decline.
Yeah.
And it sounds like that's now more marked than when you first started looking at it.
Yeah.
As you said, it was compensated by price rises, so revenue was probably staying horizontal at least. I mean, Philip Morris made the bold prediction a couple of years ago, I think, is they wanted to ditch cigarettes, support harm reduction and smoke-free products by 2025, I think it was.
And some of them are.
Some of the, yeah. I mean, there's various sort of quotes out there. How is that actually going? And, taking cannabis out of that, is that a general move for the industry?
General in a very general sense, I would say. I think what's interesting about what's happening now is that previously kind of the tobacco industry had been seen as homogenous. So even you get this phrase, big tobacco, where all of the companies are seen as being the same in a sense. But what's happening now, I think, is that you see different strategies emerging amongst the different companies, and certainly PMI is going a bit more quickly than the others in terms of this idea of moving to a smoke-free future and so on. I think what you're also seeing as well is more regional variation as well. So in developed markets, this decline is becoming more marked, as you've seen. I mean, I was speaking to an executive in one of the tobacco companies recently who said it quite plainly to me. He said basically the model is broken, this model of, okay, we can manage the declining volumes by charging people more. And that doesn't work in developed markets anymore because you have regulation in place. That means they can't use the product in certain areas. The companies can't communicate with them. If you take here in the UK, you can't brand a cigarette product. You can't then encourage or incentivize or try to strengthen that relationship that the consumer has with the product and therefore get them to pay more on a continual basis. So they have that issue now in developed markets where...
They're quite lucky it's an addictive thing though.
Well, yeah, I mean, in a sense, that was the only saving grace. But then if you look at things like e-cigarettes, which now actually offer people a way to manage that addiction, often in a way that's more affordable, that obviously is better for their health. I mean, you can see that all of these conditions together are kind of accelerating that decline. The emerging sort of and developing markets is a bit of a different story. I mean, obviously you still have markets there where the level of health awareness isn't as great, where maybe from an economic or a financial point of view, things like e-cigarettes aren't as much of an alternative because they're much more expensive than a cigarette product. And also you still have that kind of aspirational perception. People still see smoking as something that's socially acceptable, that they want to do, they want to trade up, they want to buy more expensive products and so on. But actually my conclusion as well in that is that the sort of cycle of change in the market is going to get much quicker. If you look at every year, for example, the Canadian Cancer Society produces a list of the countries with the most restrictive packaging regulations globally. And at the top of that list are countries that are in emerging markets, Laos, Hong Kong, markets like this, Vietnam, etc. So these emerging markets are actually more and more rapidly bringing in these more restrictive regulations, which will actually kind of mean that those markets will move into this decline phase that developed markets are currently experiencing more and more quickly. So all of this adds up to something that's, I don't want to use the word emergency about the tobacco companies because, we don't want to see tobacco consumption in the world, but there's a pressing need for them to start looking at other areas where they can expand their business, whether that be perhaps reduce nicotine-containing products or whether it be products that contain other substances like cannabis or other stimulants as well. So I think what we'll see in the companies is, what have been companies that traditionally have a very focused category. Tobacco companies are quite unusual if you think globally in that they only generally operate in one or two categories, whereas if you look at a Unilever or companies of similar scale, they're across different sectors. I think what we'll start to see now is companies developing what you could call a second core of categories which don't contain nicotine at all.
And just from a kind of business migration point of view, how much of the vaping industry is owned by big tobacco? Obviously, there's Juul and there's some new unicorns or whatever they're called. But how much of the vapes that are the tobacco nicotine vapes that are in the market are actually owned by big tobacco? So,
I mean, it's actually very few, particularly if you look at the kind of what you could call traditional e-cigarette products, so like the open tang type of products, probably of that market, you're talking about less than 5%
really?
By the big tobacco companies. The pod type of products, so the Juul type of closed system products, that's much more controlled by the tobacco companies because those are the type of products that they want to be selling, where you have this kind of closed ecosystem, you've got repeat business they can market, they're quite simple for people to use, etc. They can also kind of crucially communicate on the science there because it's a closed ecosystem. People can't use different bits from different suppliers and they can communicate around the safety of those products. So that category is a little bit larger. And then obviously you have a newer category now called heated tobacco, which actually is a tobacco containing type of product which is vaporized rather than combusted like you would do with a cigarette.
Just like a dry herb vape.
Exactly. It's similar to that, except they tend to process the product first as well. So you get a kind of processed cigarette type of product that you put into the device, and that's dominated by the tobacco companies. So it's sort of a spectrum, but the traditional e-cigarette type products were really kind of true disruptors in the sense that this was something that the tobacco companies didn't and still don't control. So that's something they're responding to now with these newer products they're releasing.
So it's very interesting because, I mean, look, they're very big businesses. So gives hope to all young entrepreneurs trying to disrupt, I think.
It is fascinating. Although what's interesting with the Juul thing, I think, is that they did sort of bring this move quick and break things mindset. And when you're dealing with nicotine and nicotine regulation, that's not necessarily where you want to be and how you want to be moving, and regulators aren't sort of move quick and break things type of people, you know. So there's a cautionary tale there as well. I think it has been noticeable that, you know, what had been kind of pegged as a disadvantage that tobacco companies have, and I've heard it sort of mentioned as a disadvantage for tobacco companies in terms of moving into cannabis as well, which is that they're not used to operating in kind of very high growth, high innovation spaces. And they're much more cautious in terms of the way they innovate. But ultimately, that actually is beginning maybe to look like a bit of at least a neutral, because they've been able to avoid maybe some of the worst of the opprobrium in the US that's been rained down on Juul and so on, because they've been able to act more cautiously and don't go and sell sort of, you know, crazy flavors and so on, because they're conscious of being seen to be responsible.
Yeah, I think it's a learning for lots of new businesses, I think. So, look, I think that's a great summary on where we are with the tobacco industry in general. Now let's get on to sort of talking about how cannabis fits into that. I think you and Spiros like to use the phrase green intersection of sin. Yeah. We've spoken about alcohol before. So Big Alcohol have made some major investments in this space. What's Big Tobacco done in this space?
Well, arguably as big, really, I think. So if you look, I mean, the biggest and most high-profile one is obviously Altria's investment in Kronos in the US and, well, in Canada.
So Altria are Philip Morris?
Well, it's a little bit complicated. Altria are a US-based company. They only operate in the US. And what's now Philip Morris International was spun out of Altria in 2008. So Altria sells Marlboro cigarettes in the US and owns Philip Morris USA, but they only operate in the US. And they made an investment in Kronos. We also obviously have had Imperial Brands as well, making initially investment in Oxford Cannabinoid Biotechnologies, and now a bigger investment in Oxley, also Canadian licensed producers. So we're beginning to see kind of, I think, significant moves in this area as well. I would expect at least one or two others of the companies who may be working in this area but are doing it organically. In other words, they're not going to go out and make an acquisition, but they will start launching products with cannabinoids in them, probably initially CBD, obviously. So there is very quiet, sort of deliberative action in this area amongst the tobacco companies, and I think that's something that we'll continue to see as well moving forward.
That's interesting. So, you know, the idea of developing their own things rather than through acquisition. Tobacco industry is probably, well, on the face of it, sounds like it could be well placed, you know, in that it's used to dealing with a lot of regulation and perhaps some similar methods in getting your product to market. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I think that's, you know, again, in the analysis that I did initially, looking at, you know, whether this is something the tobacco industry would and could get involved in, I think there's some very clear sort of points of leverage for tobacco companies moving into cannabis. I mean, the most obvious and initial one is that a lot of their consumers are already consuming both. So in other words, the people that they're already selling tobacco to are also highly likely or disproportionately likely to also be consuming cannabis in most markets. So there's this overlap between the consumer bases. And if you kind of think about it in a more, I mean, you mentioned the intersection of sin there. If you think about it in a kind of what I could grandiosely call a philosophical way, if you look at the reason why people have traditionally consumed tobacco or smoked cigarettes, it's for that kind of moment of pleasure, that moment of stress relief, that sort of moment of, again, what I've called in the past, not entirely uncontroversially, I think, that moment of mental wellness. So that the companies have been providing that. I mean, obviously the issue with the cigarette is that's also doing incredible physical harm as well at the same time. But there is that continuity, I think, between the reasons why people have used tobacco and nicotine and the reasons why people might use cannabis in future, you know, particularly if you use that kind of wider umbrella of mental wellness. So there's that kind of shared consumer and shared mission, I think, between the two industries that would be interesting for tobacco companies. You obviously then also have this idea of the agricultural supply chain. This is an agricultural product which they're already operating in. it's relatively easy to just stop growing tobacco in a field one day and start growing cannabis the next.
Well, I was going to say, would that be a possibility? Where is most tobacco farmed in the world?
It's still something that's farmed on every continent, more or less. I mean, less so here in Europe, although still you have tobacco farming in Poland, Italy, parts of France, and so on. Most of it will be Brazil, Southern Africa, a lot of tobacco farming in China as well, which obviously goes into the domestic market there. So again, it's across the board. We already see sort of very interesting. I mean, if you look at the US tobacco farming, so US tobacco is more expensive than tobacco from other parts of the world for, I think, obvious reasons, as other, commodities would be that are grown in the US. And tobacco farmers have found it harder and harder to compete on the international market. So you see in places like Kentucky in the US now that they've moved over in certain areas wholesale to growing hemp for CBD, and they're actually already supplying the legal cannabis industry in the US. They grow the product, they extract the CBD themselves on the farms, and then they can ship it across border because it's only CBD. And so the companies in the US are using that CBD to go into products that then sometimes actually have THC in them as well. So that, they're providing the formulation. So it's already happening in effect. You've got parts of the tobacco industry that have moved over to de facto working in the cannabis industry. So I think that background is interesting to them as well. And I think what's also interesting for tobacco companies is that given that cannabis also has that kind of supply chain, there are then other points of entry for them as well into the cannabis industry. So they don't have to look at themselves as a company that has to go in and sell finished cannabis products. I mean, we know that that's where the highest margins will be, and that's where the biggest value is. But if you sort of park that conversation,
that they can do it at scale.
Yeah, exactly. And if they say, look, maybe we don't want the heat of actually selling to the final consumer, but we could go in at some point along that supply chain and provide maybe IP or be able to provide extraction efficiencies or something along that supply chain. So it's not just that there's an agricultural aspect to this, it's also that there's a kind of an elongated supply chain as well that goes from kind of seed to finished product, where they could potentially hit different parts of that if they wanted to. And then I think that the last one then is the compliance or regulation part that you mentioned. And again, this is a debate that I think could go on for a long time. I know people engage in this, but just how the legal cannabis industry will be regulated. And I tend to see it very much as an industry that will have tobacco-like restrictions, or at the very least will be somewhere between alcohol and tobacco. And, that's obviously an area where they're very familiar. I mean, in some ways, these tobacco companies now are basically brand houses and compliance houses. The expertise they have in terms of complying with regulation and being able to, as you sort of mentioned, being able to negotiate those regulations to get the product down the funnel to the consumer is a huge advantage for them. And also, if you think about things specifically that are coming in terms of latest regulations in the EU, we have now something called the track and trace requirements, which are part of the EU tobacco directive. But that's the industry being able to say from sort of farm
to sale type stuff,
where their materials have come from. And I think that's also that kind of capacity or capability will be very important in the cannabis industry in the longer term as well. I think even from the consumer perspective, probably, if you leave aside any regulatory requirements. So, there are a lot of, if you look at it in those terms, I think there are a lot of reasons for a tobacco company to think about getting involved in this industry.
Yeah. And what's generally the attitude towards R&D? Because obviously we're only just sort of discovering lots about cannabis because we're now allowed to do more studies on it. Yeah. Is the tobacco industry generally disposed to doing research, or is it kind of, as you said, is it quite cautious? And
that's an interesting question. I mean, I said in another context, I mean, it's interesting actually. So cannabis is what, a 15,000-year-old plant where the science is still in its infancy, and as you say, we know very little about it. And I think that's both a positive and a negative, I would say, from the tobacco industry point of view. Again, I mean, there's this perception of the tobacco industry as one that's a bit sort of gung-ho and reckless about the way it's interacted with, well, let's say the way it's kind of engaged in its public responsibilities in the past. And I think, there's a large element of truth in that. But the current incarnation of tobacco, big tobacco company, is one that is very, very concerned about control, is very concerned about understanding the science, is very, very concerned about knowing exactly what it's putting into the consumer hand. And I think that's, again, something where perhaps as perverse as it might sound, they could actually play a positive role in terms of the
Well, that's what I was thinking.
because they will want to do some of this research. They will want to know more about the plant. They want to know more about cannabinoids. They want to know and be able to sort of, at least if they can't communicate that publicly, be able to know something about the efficacy or not of certain products and what certain cannabinoids can do or won't do. So I think there is certainly a role for them to play there,
Yeah, it's because we've talked on previous shows about, certainly on the medical side, a lot of the funding for research comes from, or has traditionally come from, pharmaceutical businesses. Our query whether they are that interested in doing certain types of research if it's not going to spit out a product at the end of the day that they can exploit.
Well, I think that's certainly, that's still the case for tobacco companies as well. And neither are they going to be spending, their R&D budgets are nowhere near those of pharmaceutical companies because they don't have that. That's just not the structure.
But as you said, they've only got a couple of products. So
and they just don't have that kind of period where they can sell for whatever price they write down on the piece of paper and recoup the money. So there is still certainly, and I think it's become more acute actually in the last couple of years as there's been this general kind of sense of decline within the industry. Everywhere is being tightened. So the R&D work that they are doing is even more focused on commercialization than it has ever been. But even within that context, I think they can probably do more and afford to do more than some of the, let's say, licensed producers that are working today could do in that area. So I still think, even though it's not going to be comprehensive, even if it's not going to be altruistic in that sense, it's still valuable.
I wasn't meaning to say that it would in any way replace medical research. It would be more just sort of advancing the understanding of the plant through, ultimately I guess they're pursuing another kind of commercial consumer product, but hopefully the byproduct of that is a
and even I think from the point of view of product stewardship as well, the issue with the vapes. I know you had Tim on a couple of weeks back or months back talking about the vape crisis in the US. Again, there's a role there, I think, or potentially a role for someone like a tobacco company to be able to spend the money to give that surety in terms of the product, and to be able to kind of communicate that at least to regulators, if not also hopefully to the public as well, and be able to say, look, we've tested this 1,000 ways from Sunday and this product is safe for you to use.
And thank you for segueing beautifully into my next question, which was around the vaping crisis and in the US. What's your general view on how what's been the fallout, etc.? Because as a recap, it was illegal THC cartridges that it sort of caused. Is it double digits now? Sort of more than 10 people?
Yes, I think it's into the 60s.
Oh, really? Okay, yeah. So over 60 people have died from using these illegal vape cartridges, but it's had a collateral damage effect on the wider vaping industry. It
was certainly. And again, I've been working in this space for the last 7-8 years, and it was certainly. And there's been some ups and downs within e-vapor as well. And it's certainly the hardest, most difficult time for the category since its inception. There are different ways of looking at what happened. I think there are different places you can put blame as well. I think it's quite unfortunate in the US. There's a real, and again, I don't want to get too political, but it might be symptomatic of the wider trends in that society as well, where there seems to be people who aren't listening to each other and are kind of talking across each other and talking across purposes.
Hey, we have that over here too.
Well, we're just starting to get it, unfortunately, but there's always hope. But so because I think the crisis in the US was a couple of different things wrapped together, which are not necessarily the same issue. And the main one was around youth access, I think, to nicotine through the dual product predominantly. And I think partly that was also fueled by the absence of regulation. I think the FDA have taken a long time to regulate something that and again, there are differences, but the EU has had regulation in place on this category for the last 3-4 years now, and I think that's helped in the EU because consumers, companies know how they're supposed to operate, and consumers know that there's kind of this framework in place that and they can have some confidence about what's happening. So I think the lack of regulation didn't help the way Juul behaved, particularly at the initial stages. I've already referenced that. And some of it I think was probably deliberate, and some of it was just kind of naivety in terms of getting carried away with the product they thought was going to save the world in some ways. And then on the other hand, you have this public health environment in the US which is opposed to tobacco companies, which doesn't want tobacco companies to continue to have an existence beyond the combustible cigarette, and is trying to maybe position the category in a certain way, and is trying to communicate with consumers and the public in a certain way about what these products are and aren't, and so on. So you just got this confluence of different factors that was extremely unfortunate, I think. In the sort of medium to longer term, I'm relatively hopeful, if I can use that word, that it won't damage the category globally too much, because as a delivery mechanism, I think the science, for those who want to look at it, is fairly clear that these products are much, much safer than combustion. Are a much, much safer alternative to someone who wants to smoke. And then even beyond that, potentially could be very useful delivery mechanisms, both in a kind of lifestyle sense for other substances, but even in terms of medical and more clinical uses as well. So yes, it was a hit initially, but I'm sort of hopeful in the longer term that that ultimately kind of rationality will win out. Although in the current climate,
you are hopeful.
Well, I read the other day actually that people who are optimistic live longer. So that's
cool. Let's do that.
To that.
Let's do that. I'll drink to that. I think it's quite funny that I think you're right in sort of reactionary politicians kind of making stuff up on the fly. But I think was it India that banned vaping because they're not sure of the effects.
Yes.
Whereas we are very sure of the effects of smoking tobacco, and they haven't banned that. I think that is a really kind of strange situation.
Yeah, so I mean that's completely true, but I think for fairness, I would just note that that's not just coming from India. I mean, that stance is not a uniquely Indian one. It's actually one that's coming from the WHO and those kind of organizations at a global level. So there are really different approaches to these products which are almost diametrically opposed, really. And you could argue, or some would argue, that sometimes they're diametrically opposed to the science as well. So
yeah. Again, a wider issue, I think. Cool. Well, Shane, thank you so much for that. I will finish with my traditional last question: is what did your family say when you told them you were getting into cannabis?
Well, I can,
or have you not told them?
Yeah, I can cheat on this one, I guess, a little bit, because I sort of feel like I haven't fully kind of jumped into the cannabis world yet, so I still have a kind of foot in both industries, I suppose. But I mean, so I haven't had to have that kind of formal, this is what I'm doing kind of conversation. But obviously I have spoken as I've become more involved. I don't know. I mean, I think, without wanting to be too banal about it, perceptions in general, and I think that's what you've been discussing on this podcast over the last number of years, are changing to this plant, and people are much more relaxed about it. And it's more, I think the responses I've had are more like they can see that I'm enthusiastic about it, they can see that I feel and can sense benefits in this area. So they're happier they're happier for me that I'm happy than anything else. My brothers and sisters have had some kind of sort of fairly run-of-the-mill or routine health issues, so I've had more and more conversations with them about whether cannabis or some form of cannabinoid type of product could help them, and they have a healthy skepticism, and I think that's also been useful for me in terms of the way I approach this as well, because again there can be a tendency, I think, to let things run away from you and get too excited about, maybe not too excited, but put too much weight on what this product and plant and industry can achieve. I think it can achieve a lot, but there are limitations to everything as well. So I think there's also been I've taken some of that skepticism back into the work I'm doing as well.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think we talk about it a lot on the show in terms of having a nice healthy balance. Cannabis is not going to regrow your amputated arm, despite some people's passionate belief that it
Although
cures
I'm sure
everything.
There's someone who will sell you something and tell you that it will.
Cool. Well, Shane, it's been really great to have you on and talking about this, and there will no doubt be lots more movements, so it'd be great to get you back on at some point.
Anytime. My pleasure, Nish.
Cool.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, mate.